And welcome everybody to the last motions briefing of the 2022-2023 school year. This will be our national tournament motions briefing, so I'm very excited and happy to see so many of you here. A quick overview of what the seminar is going to be. At the beginning, I thought we could start with like a Q&A and feedback on any random things that you had on your mind. Then we'll go into the motions briefing proper. And at the end, which I'm hoping we'll have time for, I put together some like a mini lecture about POIs because I feel like that's something that would hopefully be helpful to everyone. So with that, tell me what's on your mind, if anything. How are we feeling for nationals? How do we feel the spring tournaments went? Any feedback or anything that you'd like to bring up? Also, you are welcome to put something in the chat and I can either read it anonymously or just share it out loud if you can't speak. Desi is super excited. Me too. Maybe just a quick, maybe I'll say something, just in case it's not clear. So I know that last year we had a bunch of restrictions for entries, like you could only enter into a certain number of events, and you could only enter debate if you were qualified in debate. I just want to we sent an email about this earlier, but those were mostly because of COVID issues. So there are not those same entry restrictions this year. As long as you are qualified into the national tournament, you can enter into whichever events you want, just like a normal regional tournament. So like 2 in the first flight, in debate, or in poetry, you can't enter into both. So it's normal restrictions. Similarly though, like if you have qualified into debate and you wanted to bring somebody who hasn't qualified onto your team, you can't do that. You can only make teams with debate and duo with people who are also already qualified. But other than that, you can have new people who have not debated before come and join your team, or they can start a new team, just as long as they have already qualified. Yeah, Sky.
So I just have a question. So I qualified with debates, but I also want to.
You talking to me?
But I also want to do poetry. Is that possible, or are they on? Because I know that they're on the same flight.
Unfortunately, debate and poetry is the one combination you can't do. But maybe prose might interest you because they're kind of similar.
Okay, I'll have a look. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Any other questions? Oh, there we go. Yuan.
I just wanted to say hi, Julia.
Hi, I'm so glad you're here. Are you going to debate again at nationals, I'm assuming?
No, but I'm just interested in the debate motions.
Come on!
I don't have people to debate with, so.
Okay, well, I'm glad you came for spring anyway, and good luck in the other events.
Thank you.
Maria says, I love my cat and I'm super glad to see you. Me too. You could put on your cat on the screen just so we all can see if you want. The other thing is too, I am generally very excited for the motions, both these ones that have been released and the impromptu. So I'm really excited for these things. These debates coming up. This Morgan, or the people that were on our motions committee so far, we think that these are the best ones so far. So hope you agree. Okay, last chance. You can always ask in the middle, obviously. Okay, then let's get to it. These are in a random order. Oh, I see a chat. Oh, said. Okay, so the first one, this house believes that cultural treasures should be returned to their places of origin. And then the other one is assuming the technology that can accurately predict when and where people will commit crime exists. This house would use the technology to preemptively arrest those individuals. So I think that the second one, it sounds like people are struggling more with. So we'll cover that one second and just do the first one now. Cultural treasures. So I'm also going to be, like I did during the spring motions briefing, I'm going to be working off of the kind of structure that Finlay, the coach from Mege Varna, put together for his seminar in January or February about how to interpret motions, which I would recommend that you all follow to some degree as well. I will again post that document in the chat at some point so that you can download it, because I think it's really helpful to get like a really good picture of evaluating the motions. So the first thing that we are asked to do is kind of evaluate what the key actors and definitions are. So who is important in this debate? Again, I'll read the motion. This House believes that cultural treasures should be returned to their places of origin. I'm going to jump here really quickly just to define some key terms. The first one, cultural treasures. This is a term of art. So kind of translating each word or looking at the definition of each word individually will not lead to this type of definition. So whenever you're looking up this motion and doing research, you want to kind of be thinking of this as a collective term. So cultural treasures, also sometimes called cultural artifacts, are unique objects that are extraordinarily valuable or important to a particular cultural group. Usually the cultural group is a nation as well, or like a country. Cultural artifacts could be another term that I would suggest using when you're researching this motion because they're kind of used interchangeably. And another word, okay, so then we'll go back here. When we're thinking about who is important in this debate, I think that one of the main stakeholders is the idea of places of origin. So origin is where something originates, or the idea of like where the cultural treasure originally came from. So, or was found by. So like I don't know, like that old piece of gold that was found in Bulgaria, that is the place of origin is Bulgaria, or maybe part of something of ancient Egypt belongs to Egypt, even if it's displayed in New York City or London, etc. So the places of origin are likely a key stakeholder. And the reason why I have them in quotes is because I think that it can be viewed at both like the entity level, or the idea of like a country or a group of people as a whole and what they are deserved, owed, and like what they value, but also potentially the individuals within that entity. So like if there is a cultural artifact that should be located in Palestine, for example, and that the values and kind of interest of Palestinians and of being able to have that in their possession, view it, see it, have it in Palestine, might be an example of like the individuals within that place of origin. So both in the collective term of what are the interests of the nation or the cultural group, and also in the individual term portion as well. I think interestingly enough, what this debate will also include is not just the current people that are part of that group or that country, but also the historical parties that were involved with that artifact. So a lot of this debate is going to be about the idea of colonialism, or times when another country, group, power was in control of a now sovereign or formerly sovereign or like another place. So when the British Empire had a lot of colonies in Africa and in, various other places, the British Empire has a lot of cultural treasures from countries in Africa or regions in Africa that are some people say stolen or taken without payment or without like kind of regard for ownership. So it's also the idea of those historical parties of when those cultural treasures were removed at that time period, what are the people who they were removed from owed? So it's both in present day and kind of this historical perspective as well that I think could be teased out on both sides of the debate. I'll pause there. Any questions about kind of this broad picture? Yeah, Maria.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I kind of didn't understand your point about the entity and the individuals in the entity. Like, I understand the places of origin as the whole country or the government of the country, but what do you mean by individuals?
Okay, good question. What I mean by that is like, say for example, like an individual citizen or person of that country might place a lot of value in having that cultural treasure in their like vicinity or back in their home. So it's not just in the interest of like the government or that like, you know, some sort of leadership to reclaim that object, but also there might be some sort of like personal investment or satisfaction on behalf of citizens or local people that should be considered as well. I it's like one of those things where like I read a bunch of things and I have a bunch of examples, but I didn't like write any down to have a specific example, which was just poor planning on my part. But it's like, what would members of a cultural group, like what do they value, what are they owed, and what do they deserve? And how do we evaluate those kind of needs, wants, and feelings as a person, not just as like the people or the government of Ghana or the people of Ghana deserve to have this back. Does that make more sense?
Okay, yeah, now I got it. Yeah, thanks.
Other
Recording in progress.
Other questions? Okay, other key stakeholders or actors would also be the museums and private investors who this will primarily affect. So if tons of cultural treasures are currently located at the British Museum in London, or at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or in New York, or here or there, how those museums would be affected if it is the case that those cultural treasures would no longer be at those locations and literally moved. This is mostly an economic impact, but also like a preservation impact, which we'll talk about later. Private investors as well. Some of these cultural treasures at some point in the past may have been purchased. Whether those purchases are legitimate in all cases or not is up for debate, but perhaps a family or an investor has contributed a lot of money for like the Egyptian wing at the British Museum or something like that, in order to maintain and attract visitors. And the impact of moving these cultural treasures back to their places of origin will have a significant impact, not only on the museums, but also on the investors, the economy, who's going to be coming to visit these places, et cetera, et cetera. Also, the public, in terms of the public at large. So maybe not necessarily just looking at the people that are located in the places of origin, but also society who might benefit from being able to access cultural treasures in a more accessible way. So if you know, the British Museum has a bunch of different cultural treasures from all over the world, and one person is able to access education and exposure to these cultural treasures, there's potentially value in that education and benefits that are given to the public at large or to society that might not be accessible if like a majority of Chinese cultural treasures are only located in China and a majority of Americans never leave America. So what sort of cultural divides might this contribute to, exacerbate, and like lack of education, etc. Similarly to the museums and private investors is like academics, historians, researchers who might be wanting to study these cultural artifacts or preserve them in a certain way in order to prepare for like future generations. I probably should have put that later. I have that later, is like the future people of the world who would benefit from having cultural treasures that are like properly preserved and accessible and maintained. That might not necessarily be the case if they are removed from like hyper securitized, hyper specialized places like museums that have a lot of money that can, safely protect such cultural treasures. Questions about these actors or anybody that you think I might, or stakeholders that I might have missed that you want to contribute? And then who is this house? I don't think it's particularly relevant. This is like a value debate, like should we do something or should we not, which we'll talk about in a second. And I know that I'm speaking a lot about like different potential groups, and I want to also give you a reminder that like I'm listing all of these things, but like a strong proposition or a strong opposition case doesn't necessarily have to talk about all of these different stakeholders or actors. They can pick the ones that are most relevant and identify the ones that the other team will probably most likely be focusing on and kind of prepare that way. These are just like places to start in order to think about the motion. I already went through the definitions. So cultural treasures, what those are, also known as cultural artifacts. Another word that might be helpful in your research is repatriation. Repatriation is the idea of returning. It can literally be like a culture, an object, but it can also be a person or a number of things. Moving something from one place to back to where it came from is the idea of repatriation. So when you're doing your research, you will probably come up on that word a lot. And so instead of, like, another way to phrase this motion would be, this house believes that cultural treasures should be repatriated, period. And then the other key word in here is should. And I want to take a moment to kind of broaden this out a little bit so that you can have a good framework for how to evaluate should debates in a clearer way. So generally, and I'm taking this from this really awesome book that our lovely judge Chris Totten found. So I'll send that link as well. Let me put that here. That talks about how to evaluate should debates, or at least where you should start. And generally, when you see a motion that has the word should in it, it's asking you to prove broadly two things on both a moral and a practical level. So what we call this is like a moral imperative. An imperative is like a push to do something, or a push to, or a reason to do something. So when it's asking for should these treasures be returned to their places of origin, you want to look on both levels. Is this the right thing to do? But not only that, is this reasonably able to be done? So something can be right, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can do it. And obviously the other way is true too. Just because you can do something, aka it's practical, doesn't mean that it's right to do. So typically when you're evaluating these debates, you should be thinking about both this on the prop is like, okay, we have a bunch of reasons why this is the right thing to do, but you also need to be thinking with your team, okay, but how would this be done? Sometimes that's done in like a model situation. I don't think necessarily here the model is super important, but in general is like, is it reasonable, or how can we justify moving these cultural treasures, not just like physically moving them, but also like taking away, or not taking away, but like changing economic and like museum models that currently exist in order to, one, the economic reasons, two, the idea of preservation and kind of security or safety, all of those things. So what you'll see in this debate, I think, is a lot of this moral versus practical debate. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to debate those impacts later. But when you are debating on both the prop and the op, kind of thinking about these things on both levels, about the motions on both levels, will help you not only to like broaden your understanding of the motion, but also make for a stronger case. This doesn't mean that you have to be like 100% the best on both the moral and the practical side, but you should at least give consideration to both. And when you can, make strong arguments on both levels. Questions? Okay. The next part of Finlay's model is identifying what your advocacy is. So what is each side actually arguing for? Answering the question, is prop just arguing that something is bad, or is prop arguing for some action to be taken? So for this one, we can see that prop has to be arguing for an action to be taken. They're not just saying that cultural treasures being like located outside of their places of origin is a bad thing. They're going one step further and saying yes, is in saying that they should actually be returned to their places of origin, which is important. So we say that the advocacy for the prop needs to prove that in fact they should be returned, and there is an imperative to do so, that this needs to happen. It's not just like a good idea, but like it needs to happen for the reasons that you'll just explain in your case. And the opposition should say, no, they should not be returned for specific reasons. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that the op has a little bit of flexibility here in which they can agree that maybe it's wrong that cultural treasures have been removed from their like native lands, but still that does not mean that they should be returned, and here's why. And then they can have their reasons. So this gives the op a little bit more flexibility in being like, yeah, we agree that it like colonialism is bad and thievery is bad and stealing goods from and stealing like cultural artifacts from occupied regions was a bad thing, but still it is a huge risk for XYZ regions to try to transport these and remove them and give them back to the places of origin. We also sometimes don't even know where they're from, which just leads to lots of confusion, et cetera, and therefore you should vote opposition because we don't think that they should be returned, or at least this shouldn't be a major shift in policy that we have. Questions? Okay, next. A model. For this motion, I really don't think a model is needed. I mean, maybe if you want to clarify that you don't mean absolutely every cultural treasure, but you mean like cultural treasures that have a clear place of origin or a clear, I don't know, you can clearly identify where they're from, or at least the general region. Maybe you might exclude cultural treasures that have been like paid for or like purchased in an ethical and modern capacity, like something that just was bought by a museum from a government within, you know, the past 20, 30 years or whatever your threshold is, something that would provide limits to what the proposition is arguing for, but not necessarily like a model of like, we're going to set up a commission to evaluate what are cultural treasures and stuff like that. I think that's too dramatic. So maybe putting some like reasonable limits on the motion would be good, but I don't think to the extent of a model is necessary. And then lastly, potential impacts and how we weigh them. I think that like the morality arguments are really strong on the proposition side. So the idea of respect, justice, ethical reasons, particularly related to colonialism, maybe looking at the idea of like righting historical wrongs, there's lots of deep research and like argumentation that can be made on that side with the proposition. On the opposition, we could talk about the efficacy, whether, so like how well this would be done to achieve or to like make right those wrongs because of issues like lack of documented proof of where these places come from, whether or not countries or regions have a legitimate claim to them, whether or not cultural treasures could fall into the wrong hands or be put into an unsafe environment, either in terms of like they're not being preserved in the right way and or they have a threat of being stolen, things like that, which might affect how things, you know, the imperative that we have to preserve, display, and maintain these treasures for future generations. Also, we're talking about like economic implications at both like the current economic system where it's like museums get a bunch of money from this, and maybe which is bad for museums, but maybe it could be really good for the places that would now reclaim their cultural treasures to boost tourism and have more funds and other sorts of investment into their economy, because they now are the owners or the protectors of these cultural treasures. So economic pools back and forth, and then also the obvious like cultural impacts to like what it means for like the country to be able to kind of receive these historical cultural treasures back into their places of like where they came from. What does this mean now? What does it mean historically? What does it mean for the future? How does this affect ideas of colonialism and ideas of like ethical considerations? I don't know if that's the best way to phrase things, but kind of walking through all of these, I feel like, are the potential impacts. It's going to be, I think, a lot of this like weighing morality versus practical things, and also like scope and depth of the extent to which like restoring cultural treasures could like resolve ethical like wrongdoings. Yeah, Johan.
Could we say that these countries, which are not the countries of origin, that possess these artifacts, can create a sense of unity between the country of origin and the country which is not the country of origin?
So I think that could be an argument, and I like that idea. I feel like that I would broaden it a little bit more to talk about how it might, like maybe a little bit of what I was saying at the beginning is like, by having more people exposed to these artifacts might increase education, knowledge, cultural and mutual understanding between like the rest of the world and the place of origin. Perhaps, yes, there could be some sort of like mutual exchange. I think historically though, a lot of these artifacts are owned or located in like Britain or in America, which have those histories of like colonialism. So it's not necessarily like those connections are necessarily being stronger, but maybe general populations being able to see them is that like forming that connection and bridging those gaps, which are good. Other thoughts? Thank you. Other thoughts, questions, things that I might have missed, or things you'd like to add?
I want to ask something. Is it reasonable as either side, proposition or opposition, to exclude from the motion returning such cultural treasures, the origin countries of which have made no claims to get them back, essentially? Does that make sense? Like,
I think that's a really good point, because there are some cultural treasures that are like hotly like claimed and like fought for, but I feel like I read a statistic that like 80 or something % of artifacts don't have like a claim to it, which means that I feel like if the proposition would limit the motion in that way, or be like, we will only do it if there's a legitimate claim, I think that might not be a significant enough change to like garner offense or to like resolve the issues that the prop is trying to issue. I feel like the better way to do it would be like almost the opposite, in terms of like, this is the general intention or goal would be to return most cultural treasures to their places of origin, regardless of claim. But in cases of like, we literally found this floating in the ocean and there's no way to know where it came from, if it came from Greece or Bulgaria or Macedonia, you know what I mean? Something like that, then saying like, we're not going to talk about those very, very specific like examples that have like no way of being retraced or replaced. Kati?
Hi, so how would you say we should approach countries that have different cultures, and how would you say we should approach oh my god, I'm sorry. Let me think about how we should phrase hold on. I'm gonna type it in the chat because I need a moment to clear my thoughts.
Okay. Maybe I will touch on something that I think could be a debated issue while you type that. I think that something that I was reading when I was researching this motion is like, this could also create a lot of issues in terms of like ongoing conflicts that have longstanding cultural and historical backgrounds, like India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestine, of like disputed place of origin or disputed ownership based on culture and not nation states, or like based on historical nation states or land that is now occupied by a current territory. And I think that those could be opposition arguments for reasons why like going into this like sort of movement is actually causing more issues than it's helping, at least in those types of areas. I'll let you type your comment, but that sparked something in me that I read but did not include in the slides. Whoever iPhone is, hello.
Yeah, hi, it's Maria from Varna. I wanted to ask about what you just started clarifying. For example, if we have an artifact that is found, I don't know, somewhere in current Turkey, but it was previously, when it was created, it was Greece, and now there's like an ongoing debate between Turkey and Greece whether which place is considered the country of origin, the place of origin, Turkey or Greece in such situations? Or is that a point that the opposition can make in terms of, I don't know.
I definitely think so. I'm gonna mute you just because I'm echoing. I definitely think that that's an opposition argument, especially because, I mean, when I'm looking at the wording here and it's like places of origin, makes me think of like geographic location and not necessarily like cultural or ethnic origin spots. So I think that the risk of like inciting more argument or conflict between places, like what's the conflict that I'm thinking of like the argument that people have, I don't know, like, yeah, I think that that's an argument that can be made, and like kind of the differences between cultural ownership or like who occupied the land at the time that it was being taken versus modern day, how that's going to affect things. I think that's a argument that should definitely not be the main or like the primary, let's go all in on this, but I think it can definitely be like an argument that shows why it's not going to be the efficacy of this type of idea, wrongful possession. I think that that's what I was thinking of when I put this second bullet point. Oh, go ahead.
So initially, you think that prop should define places of origin as the actual geographic place rather than more of a historical, cultural sort of origin?
I think it's debatable. When I'm reading it, that's the first thing I think of is geographic, but I feel like if prop has like sufficient reasons to define it as like cultural, historical, they can do that. When I'm reading places of origin, I think geographic, but maybe that's up for debate. Okay. Kati asks, how should we approach artifacts from minority cultures? Think Indigenous Americans and Russians, Sami people from Scandinavia, namely ones that are located in their respective countries. How would we define place of origin then? I would imagine like place of origin would be like, I'm only going to speak, not only, but like I'll take the Indigenous, like Native Americans, maybe artifacts that were taken from Native Americans might be repatriated or given back to Native American people, whether or not they are currently located on the land that it was taken up from. So maybe regardless of whether we define place of origin geographically or like culturally, maybe it's just like with the intent of returning the artifact to the group of people or to the region, depending on the circumstance of the situation, that were previously the original owners or like who it previously belonged to. Now, on the opposition side, you can say, okay, that's fine, but like Maria said earlier, like maybe that's going to create some issues in terms of like disputes between countries and groups of in cultures and nationalities that don't exist now because this isn't up for debate. And I think that that's something that can be put into the debate and evaluated as it happens. Like, you know what I mean? Like evaluated in terms of like, is this going to create more problems than it solves? I think that the general spirit of the motion, though, with regards to Pati's question, is about like giving back those or like returning the artifacts to the rightful owners or their previously historical owners. Maria from Varna, do you have another follow-up before I go to Maria from Ruse?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, other Maria.
Yeah, to add up to what Katya stated, like we define places of origin not only as the geographical place or the government or the country, but also the people, so the individuals. And for example, if they are a minority group, part of a bigger country right now, then they are still a group of people to whom this cultural impact would be of significance. So we could return it to them, but it will be located on the geographical sites of the United States, for example. So maybe that could be a good interpretation. And if they are like scattered all over the world because they are minority groups, then maybe we could like have the biggest minority group and place it there, so it could be more accessible to other people as well, and as and also to the representatives of that minority group in other places. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that that sounds like a really good interpretation. Good. Any other questions on the cultural artifacts motion before we move on? Okay, then let's talk about the second motion, which is the crime motion. Just give me 1 second to check my. Okay. Oh
I
yeah.
have no idea where the hand thing is, so I'm just gonna
Go
jump
ahead.
in really quickly.
Go ahead.
This might be like kind of not the best question to ask. But how far can the proposition try to push it? Can you try to run a model in which you state that the artifact will be returned with mindfulness to the integrity of the artifact itself? Put like a claim behind, like a kind of try to dodge a few bullets there.
Like which ones would we be trying to dodge?
Preservation, like kind of transportation issues or like lack of ability of the country of origin to preserve the artifact properly. Like, does a prop have the ability to value the artifact's integrity above the transportation, like return?
Like by saying like you would exclude objects that if they were returned to their place of origin, they would be damaged or lost.
Yep. Yeah, kind of.
I think that's an opposition argument, so I don't think that the prop
okay.
would go that far. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so, but I thought it was better to ask. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, let's talk about the crime motion. Assuming the technology that can accurately predict when and where people will commit crime exists, this House would use the technology to preemptively arrest those individuals. Preemptively arrest means arrest them before they actually commit the crime. So what I want to do first is talk about this part that I have in bold, which is kind of like the preface to the motion. Because I don't know that we've necessarily had like an assumption motion before to kind of explain what this does. And it's actually not that different from what we've seen before with like info slides. So the point of the assumption motions, at least in this example, is to give us, or to give the debate like a clearer picture of the prop world to set up the debate and to kind of overcome some sort of like insurmountable barrier or like a barrier or an obstacle that would make it impossible to be prop. So it kind of gives the prop a little boost in order to have a debate that otherwise couldn't be had. So it's similar to an info slide in that this information about the technology accurately predicting the crime is not up for debate. The opposition can't be like, but what if it's inaccurate? That's not a question. We're assuming that it's accurate in order to have a debate about the merits of the second half of the motion, about the merits of using this technology and whether or not the technology is good or bad. So when you're kind of framed, how I kind of broke down what this assumption is into two parts, which is the first, which is the idea that the crime would surely occur absent the intervention. So if the technology can predict when and where people will commit crime, the idea of people will commit crime means that if the intervention is not happening, the crime will happen, like the person will commit the crime. And secondly, that the technology is actually capable of recognizing that crime accurately and likely fairly. So the technology is not going to make a mistake. It could theoretically like read the mind of the person and theoretically like see the future. I would also argue, or not argue, but I think that it's reasonable to assume that this technology would not have many of the issues of technology that we have today in terms of like racial bias and other sorts of like inequitable deployment or results coming from the technology. I think that this is imagining a world like into the future where it's just like, yes, like the technology is accurate and it's not going to disproportionately discriminate against certain groups of people. Sky?
So I have a quick question. Seeing as, you know, you're saying that assume that the technology it can predict, you know, like accurately predict. So as the opposition, for example, you're not then allowed to say the technology could be hacked, for example, or are we allowed to do that?
I would say I didn't think about the hacking argument. I don't think that this type of motion precludes that, because I think that the hacking argument could be made on the op, because technology that accurately predicts when and where doesn't mean that it's not able to be like penetrated. I didn't really think about that argument. I would say it's fair game for the opposition. I don't know if it's the core of the motion though, but maybe you could prove me wrong. But I don't think I think that's okay for op.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on Sky's question either. Be welcome to hear them. Maria?
Is it a question of which one? Because I see the other Maria still raising her hand, and I don't know if that's a technical issue.
I am raising my hand, but go first.
Sorry. I thought it was just held up from last time.
Okay, never mind. But thank you, Mimi. I want to ask about the discrimination point that you just made, that it couldn't exist within the premises of this motion. But I don't think that's true, because like all algorithms and systems, they start from something. They need their basis, they need their grounds, they need their like backup drive full of other pieces of information. If you look how ChatGPT, for example, right now thinks, it uses like this huge database. And if this database is unrightfully made or was created not like considering those factors, then couldn't this be a premises of talking about like some kind of a discrimination when the AI or that technology is making such assumptions?
I think you're bringing up a really, really good point, and especially like in modern technology, facial recognition, AI, et cetera, this is like a very, very prevalent issue. But I think that because of the nature of the wording of the motion and also like the intent of the motion, I think that says that assuming the technology can accurately predict, I think precludes or makes it so that that sort of like discriminatory basis and other sorts of like flaws in modern technology does not exist in the future of this motion, of the world of this motion. So for me, at least, I don't think that those questions are part of this debate, and that's why, like, this is kind of like the info slide, or like the thing that should just be taken as fact, and that should not be part of the debate. But that is my opinion, and if you believe strongly in it, or anybody believes strongly in it and like wants to introduce that to the debate, you can, but that would be my suggestion, is like based on the fact that it says assuming it's accurate, I think precludes discrimination.
Okay, thanks, Julie.
Other Maria?
Yeah, I actually have two questions. So firstly, in my team, it was kind of discussed and debated whether people will commit crime means that we actually know the crime and the specifics of the crime. For example, do we know that it's a premeditated murder, or that it's self-defense murder, or something of the sort? Are we completely informed of the specifics of the crime and the circumstances, or do we just know that it's a crime?
I would imagine that we would know the specifics. I would think that, like, for example, if this is very futuristic, obviously, which I think it makes the motion interesting. Like, if there were a situation in which some guy throws a punch at the bar, the other person pulls a knife out to defend himself, and then the first person pulls a gun out, and then therefore the guy with the knife that stabs the first guy murders him, right, but was acting in self-defense, you know, and then the guy with the gun, whatever, like all of that would be prevented by the software, because the first person wouldn't have punched him in the first place, because that was a crime that was prevented by the technology. So I think that we would know that, like, the assault would happen, but the like attempted murder with the gun wouldn't necessarily be part of it, because the initial assault punch in the bar wouldn't have happened in the first place. So I would say that generally, like, the technology would distinguish between like different types of crime, but not necessarily be able to like go for like various like extents.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And also, since this motion and this part of the motion is kind of futuristic, as you already said, is it smart on the side of the proposition to actually define some aspects of this first part, or is it just, I don't know, meaningless and a loss of time?
My gut would say that it's a loss of time to try to describe the technology, because I feel like this is pretty clear beyond maybe if you wanted to just, I mean, except maybe if you wanted to just be like, it would know what type of crime it is, like clarifying the question you just asked me. But I wouldn't try to make up the technology, because I think that just puts you into more hot water, like leaves you more open to attack than necessary on the prop.
Yeah, I was asking about clarifying on the thing I just asked. Yeah. But thank you. Thank you.
Katya?
So I have a question about retroactive crime. So for example, something was legal up until a certain point, legislation was changed and it's now illegal. How does that work in this world? Is there any point to even touch upon that?
Something was legal but is now illegal?
Yes, for example, like very macabre example, but abortions in the US right now.
I would say that since the technology is predicting crime, retroactive crimes can't be intervened, because it's like before the technology didn't exist. Now once the technology exists and everything going forward, it will prevent crime that is like prevent actions that are illegal from the moment the technology is approved and going into the future, but it wouldn't be able to affect previous retroactive crime. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Go on.
So about Sky's question about the hacking thing, I think it will be an important argument for the opposition because if this technology can accurately predict when and where people will commit crime, then they will believe firmly in what the technology says, and it will create problems because if there is not a real crime, I mean, people can hack and show a crime and at the same time do another crime while they're investigating the fake crime. So, but the proposition can rebut because if this is so futuristic and it will be in the future, then they will have a system to secure all of these hacking bugs and things, and it will probably won't be, people won't be able to hack the technology. So it's a questionable argument.
I think that you've explained how I would imagine that debate going very well. So yeah, I would agree. Maria, I'm gonna pause for you and go to Borko really quickly.
Yeah, I just wanna give my 2 cents on the whole hacking thing, and like I think the core of the motion is, should we persecute people before they've committed those crimes? So I think focusing on stuff like hacking or how the system works exactly is just going away from the motion in itself.
I think I would agree with that. I think I accidentally kicked Maria out. Maria, are you still here?
Yeah, and I felt pretty bad, like abandoned.
I silenced you.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. I was messing around with my mouse and all of a sudden it's like Maria's in the waiting room. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So throughout answering our questions, you kept saying, like with the example of the punching guy, that this technology would prevent this, but behind that verb, what do you imagine? Like, how does the court process of that look like? How before accident does that happen? And like, because this should matter, if this is an assault, then should the guy be arrested 1 month prior, or I don't know, not arrested but maybe fined or something like that? And yeah, because is it like the technology analyzes us from like being kids and stuff and sees to our future what crimes could be committed, or I don't know.
I think that I'm not sure if you heard the entirety of Borko's like take on these types of questions about like going too deep into the technology and like at what point. I don't know if it's necessarily like, I don't think that it would go as far as to like remove a baby knowing all of the future transgressions that it's going to commit, removing the baby and putting it in social services so that it doesn't become like a murderer or something. I don't think that that's what this motion is talking about. I think that it's just like the core of the motion is like, should we hold people responsible for actions that they don't commit, knowing that they will commit them? I mean, how I would imagine this is like a little like flying saucer appears and sucks up the person right before he hits the person in the face. That's just how I would imagine it. I don't think that there would be lots of interlude, but let's move on because I see how late it is and I don't want to keep people longer than they have. And then we can come back to questions for people that are able to stick around. Okay, so with that being said, I think that the model is really important on the proposition in terms of making it so that the proposition is like in a good spot to have a case, because this is obviously a very, very like dramatic motion and like requires a lot of things. So on the proposition, kind of painting a picture of the world is a really good thing without going necessarily into the details of like the technology itself and like how many seconds before the crime is committed, the technology stops things and in what ways. I think it's more so of just like describing the world in general. So as I've said already, the accurately predict would mean that the crime would surely occur absent the intervention. And then maybe the proposition is talking about what will happen like post-arrest. How will this form of criminal justice compare with what we have today? Thinking about, is there going to be a trial? Will there be questions of, looking maybe into how like intent to commit a crime today in the penalties associated with that compares to the actual committing of that crime? Will people that are intervened in this new criminal justice system or like world be prioritized to get rehabilitation or punishment, and etc. So I think focusing less on developing a model for the technology itself and a model more so that discusses what sorts of like what this criminal justice system or idea looks like to defend against the status quo, or like to establish in this world. And I think that this will help to frame the arguments about like that Borko was mentioning that we'll talk about in a second. So with that being said, now that we've kind of talked about what this assumption part is, what the majority of the debate should be focused on is the second half of the motion, like it's normal. So is it a good idea to use such technology in this way or not? Is it a good idea to use the technology to preemptively arrest people? Is that a good policy model, etc., which we're going to talk about now? The key actors and definitions. This is similar to the other criminal justice things that we've talked about. Society as a whole, is this creating a utopian or a dystopian society? The perpetrators are the people who would commit the crime, the victims, and the government in terms of like the government's interest in potentially controlling its population, protecting its population, etc. Who is this house? I think that governments is the house. The governments would use the technology to preemptively arrest individuals. Other terms that would possibly lead to confusion, we would go back to the model in terms of like how to clarify things that might otherwise lead to confusion, which we talked about earlier. In terms of advocacy, the prop is proving that this technology has benefits that outweigh the cons. So using this technology and adopting it in this future world is something that would bring more benefit than harm. And the opposite, which is the harms of this technologies and the implications in its use, which we'll talk about in a second, outweigh the benefits. Before we go on to impacts, any like clarification questions? Yes.
How much can the proposition mess around with well, not the technology, but everything that comes after technology? So obviously you mentioned about trials and about prisons and rehabilitation afterwards. Do you think that this is like too outside of the scope of the actual model?
Kind of how I phrased it when I was talking to somebody about it was like, the proposition can't go to the extent that there would be no consequences for this person, because you know what I mean? Like, it's not going to be like, I don't think the proposition can create a utopian world where like the government intervenes and there's no repercussions. But I think that by being like, here are realistic criminal justice paradigms, policies, like approaches to things, like there's a difference between intent and actually committing the crime. Different types of crime have different severity. So like stealing a piece of gum from the corner store is different than murdering somebody. Those sorts of same levels and same distinguishing characteristics that exist now would also exist in this future world. So like somebody that was going to go murder somebody, like they still have those intentions and therefore need to be dealt with in a way that makes sense. Like just stopping them from pulling the trigger doesn't mean that that person shouldn't be like effectively like, or like shouldn't the government, I mean, the proposition can't be like, okay, we stopped them from doing it, so therefore the urge never existed and they didn't have those instincts or those intentions. Like there would still need to be some sort of repercussions. Maria?
After all that you just said, does it mean that it is reasonable for the proposition to say that an arrest will occur only for crimes that are, more serious, Like, for example, you won't arrest a person for pickpocketing or something that you wouldn't arrest them for normally.
Well, I think that a crime necessitates arrest, as does the motion, because it does say this technology to preemptively arrest. So I think that arrest would mean to like take into custody, and if it ends up just being a fine, like for spray painting graffiti on the bridge or something, then that fine would happen. But like, I do think that they would be arrested or like intervened by the government.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Also, for anybody that has to leave, I did not think that this was going to go on this long. Hence why I prepared another half of this seminar. So if you have to leave, you can catch the recording later. I don't necessarily have any announcements. So thanks for coming if you do have to leave. Otherwise, we will try to wrap up in a reasonable amount of time. Yep, Sky.
I just have a question. So to clarify, our debate motion is about the bigger crimes, not the, for example, pocket picking and the other smaller crimes. We're talking about like killing and
No, I think it
other-
is. I think it is about all types of crime. I don't think it's limited to one or the other. I think that depending on what approach your team wants to take or the team wants to take on either side, you may put more or less emphasis on smaller or bigger crimes. But I do think that all crimes are included in this. Kind of what I was saying earlier, though, is that like the same facets that we have in like present day criminal justice, where like spray painting a bridge and committing terrorist attack have different consequences, those same levels of consequences would be probably mirrored to a large extent in this future world as well. Okay. Potential impacts, crime prevention, obviously. So both like actually preventing crimes from happening, especially like violent crime, and also the deterrent effect that this technology would have. If you know you're going to be arrested, will you even intend to commit the crime in the first place, or put yourself in a situation in which you would you be deterred from that? Societal impacts, is this going to create, how is this going to affect, society as a whole in terms of like people to people interactions? It's going to create a police state. Is this going to create a safer society in which violent crime doesn't exist anymore, etc.? How does this impose on free will and privacy? Could this be seen as a government overreach, etc.? I think that there were some concerns that this might be a harder to debate on the proposition side. And I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how weighing impacts might matter and how phrasing things might help. Because when you're thinking about moral versus practical impacts, and this is also broader, we talked about the idea at the beginning of like should, what that means in emotion, and how you have to think about it on both like the moral and the practical side of things. I think also thinking about generally kind of weighing two different types of impacts. So in this, the proposition might be more defending like practical impacts of like, if you knew that this shooter was going to go into the school in Nashville and shoot 6 people, including 3 children, and you could stop that, right? That's a very practical, real world example that has like very tangible effects, and how that can be weighed against the idea of like government shouldn't have such power. Like, how do we go about comparing these things and making it so that we can win on either side? So when you're thinking about comparing two different types of impacts, moral versus practical, ethical versus governmental, et cetera, some questions you can ask yourself are, should one impact always be evaluated first? Should we always prioritize securing one type of impact? Should we always try to save lives no matter what, even if it infringes on a person's right to privacy or a person's free will? Is saving the life of that 9-year-old in Nashville Does that always outweigh the other? Another one, does one impact always outweigh the other? Etc. Are you just objectively winning an argument, or is one impact objectively stronger on the typical things that we talk about with probability, magnitude, time frame, reversibility? Are you just really ahead in one of those dimensions on both, even if you're directly comparing the arguments? How can you explain that? And then I think the strongest way to do this when you're thinking through this is, how do these different arguments interact with each other? Does compromising on morals make the practical impacts inevitable? The other way around? So does allowing, if you were trying to argue on, say, the proposition side that preventing school shootings or preventing terrorist attacks is always like, is not only like practically good, but you're trying to what we call access the moral level, is like, we have a moral obligation to prevent harm, and governments have a moral obligation to prevent harm against its citizens, and therefore it would be immoral not to use this technology. So kind of framing things in the terms of the other impact is what I think is like kind of that like final nail in the coffin of how to win arguments whenever you're debating on two different levels, or you're debating on like two impacts that kind of could otherwise seem to be like ships passing in the night. Okay, that is what I had prepared for the motions discussion. Any questions that we want to get back to? Or anything anyone would like to add, even if it's not a question, but just like a thought?
I have a question. So you mentioned free will and privacy, and I just don't know how how either of these is applicable when it comes to like crime prevention, right? Because I feel like people who are thought to be, for example, in cartels and stuff like that, right? The government has a certain right to, well, not essentially like spy on them or listen into conversations, but in most cases, governments have rights to do certain things, especially, and not even only, but let's say only when it comes to crime prevention. And I think it's kind of similar for free will when it comes to crime prevention.
I think that the way that they would distinguish between like present status quo and what the proposition would be advocating is that like privacy in terms of like theoretically in this world, like the government would have access to a person's private thoughts and intent, and therefore that person would be held responsible for those thoughts before that they were actually acted upon. Even though we know they'll be acted upon, but still that further invasion of privacy, which is different from other sorts of like things that happen now. On the free will side of things, it's like, if a person is starving and chooses to steal a loaf of bread from the market, that is a crime that they have the free will to commit with the understanding of consequences. And under this model, they wouldn't be able to steal that loaf of bread. Will they starve? Right? How does this sort of thing infringe on free will in that regard? Or to the other extent is like, a person's a murderer. Like, do you know what I mean? I don't know. I think that there's a bunch of like layers to that this would affect that are not same in the status quo. Yohan?
For example, about the free will and privacy, well, suicide is a crime too. So by stopping people to commit suicide, they're getting in their private lives and free will. So that could be an argument. Choosing to harm your own self, that is a crime by abusing drugs and other stuff, and that could be an argument.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. Other thoughts or questions before we close out? I think maybe I'll do like a recorded mini video about POIs and upload it to Best YouTube or something, just so that people can watch later if you want, but I don't have time to do it now and it's already too late. But any other questions about the motions or nationals before we hop off? Yeah, Katya.
So again, this kind of circles back to the mechanism of the actual technology, and for that I apologize. The way I'm gonna frame this is there any point, again, like for prop or for op, is there any point to consider in the debate crimes of passion and non-premeditated crimes?
As in, would those be recognized as having a difference?
Not necessarily difference, but basically, again, it kind of comes to the limits of the technology. Like if it's reading thoughts technically and there is no intent to commit the crime for like up until, for example, 5 minutes until the crime is actually committed, will the technology be able to recognize that? And again, the question here is more so, should we use that in the debates? Is there any point in actually touching upon that?
I definitely think that this would be used. I think that these crimes, even if they're not longly premeditated, I think that they still would be detected by the technology. And I think I would use that on the prop side of things is like somebody catches their lover in bed with somebody else and they go and grab an axe on the way in and murder their significant other and the person they're cheating on them with, right? Like that's clearly a crime of passion that person does not have those like long-term negative thoughts and stuff. It was just acting on that. And therefore this technology would not only save the lives of the lover and the person that they're cheating with, but also which is like objectively good, but also it would prevent that person from being going to jail for murder. And instead it would be like, okay, you acted impulsively and we will rehabilitate you and maybe you'll get a slap on the wrist, but your life isn't ruined because you didn't commit that crime. So I think that would be a really strong prop argument for reason why this technology is good.
Thank you. And I actually have another point. So resisting arrest, for example, if the technology is able to see that during arrest of an individual, they're going to do something. They're going to, for example, kill an officer or perhaps kill themselves. Will it be able to recognize that? And will the arrest still happen? How exactly will it function in that way? Again, do you think this is of any merit? This is of any weight to the debate?
I haven't really thought about it too much, but it sounds like something that the technology would affect, or this world that would be involved in this world. So I think that if you have thoughts about arguments or how this could go one way or the other, it seems like it would fit. I just don't know if I've given enough thought to how I would drag that out or expand that to make it a strong argument one way or the other.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Before everyone goes, I'm gonna drop in the chat the motion interpretation guide as well as the link to this book that's really, really helpful. I just put it in there now that I recommend that you save. And if you have time, maybe you're not gonna read the whole book, but you could search or look at the table of contents and see things that might be helpful for things that we haven't covered or different interpretations of things that are different from just the voice of debate coordinator Julia. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. I did record this. Thank you to Sophia. So I will post this on the YouTube channel as well as put things in the Facebook event page and the Discords for you to circulate or rewatch if you need. But thank you everyone for coming. This is probably my last official debate seminar as debate coordinator. So it's always been lovely. And I am very, very excited to see you all at nationals. So good luck in preparing. If you need anything, you can always email or message me or whatever, and can't wait to see you soon.
Thank you for the seminar. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you so much, Julia. Bye.